Today, we're going to do a bit of a reaction to two videos that dropped in the last 24 hours from Sports Card Live, Jeremy Lee, and then also Mike Geo from Sports Card Nonsense. These videos had some commentary around the impact that, large influencers had on our hobby. And there's a few things that I want to talk to here that I think are pretty important. Now, the two videos in question are pretty interesting themselves. If you want to check them out and understand some more context to what I'm talking about, here's the Jeremy Lee one. Taking Stock is the show with Dennis. And then also Mike Geo on behalf of Sports Card Nonsense with his new weekly show. I'm going to be on there in 2 weeks' time. The thing that was pretty interesting in this is that some of the commentary came up around, the impact that people like Jeff Wilson and Gary Vee has had on the hobby, and how, whilst they were talking positively about the hobby, the viewer themselves need to take the most accountability when it comes to their actions on behalf of what these people were talking about. Now, that does make sense, right? Because I've talked to that before on this channel. But at the same time, there's a few counterpoints to that need to sort of be kept front of mind. A lot of the people that are coming out and saying that, Jeff Wilson or Gary Vee didn't do anything wrong, or the way they presented their content and the way they presented the success of the hobby and the growth of the hobby was okay because, me looking at it, I could see through that. I'm not taking the advice from those kinds of individuals. I know better. And that is a fairly fair assessment to make because it's the same thing when I watch their content, right? But the thing that people need to keep front of mind is that a lot of people weren't thinking like that, right? There's a lot of people that were new to the hobby in 2020 and 2019. And again, this is not me telling anything new, but I think this portion of it needs to be kept front of mind when you're looking at it, because you had new people come in with essentially disposable income that was, handed to them through the likes of various governments, because obviously we were in the middle of a pandemic, or they were no longer going to work or anything like that, working from home. So they were able to save and save and save. So the fact that you sort of had so many new participants in the hobby, right? And then they're listening to the likes of Jeff Wilson give his top 5 picks every week, or they're listening to the likes of Gary Vee telling you to chase, top space cards of the likes of LeBron and Kobe, irrespective of the pop reports. They're seeing that they have all this extra money that sort of came easy to them, so they followed that kind of information blindly. Now, I don't think that's a stretch of a statement to make. It's pretty obvious given, some of the habits we saw over that, 18-month period. Again, people need to take accountability for their own actions, but you can't sort of say that in one sense and then wash away sort of the other side of things as well, because the issue with this, and this goes to the comments from Jeremy and Mike specifically, I don't have a problem with either of them. I just think it's an interesting talking point to sort of counter on, is that when they're sort of pushing back and saying people should know better and it's okay, nobody was really listening, they're looking at it through the lens of an experienced collector, right? When in reality, the people that were most impacted by this were the new participants to the hobby, the people that were sort of inexperienced and didn't really know what to do, or they were following the person that was at the forefront of the industry, right? They were talking about that messaging. And it's not so much them going out and buying the specific card. You've had people with these very large channels, including, Gary Vee, and essentially both of those for a small period of time, maybe a 6-month period during that boom, were, like Mike Geo explained in his video today, the landing page for people within the hobby, right? If you were looking into sports cards or you were caught up in the buzz and you were new, you'd search about sports card collecting, sports card investing, buying and selling sports cards, and you'd be immediately navigated towards the likes of Gary and Jeff. Now, either intentionally or unintentionally, right, their messaging helped feed this sort of mindset. And now, again, this is nothing breaking news that I'm telling you, right? We've talked about this before, but I think it's just something, again, to keep front of mind, because, it's not just the messaging from them. These accounts were so big, they were getting big views. So then you had other content creators off the back of that try and tell the same sort of story. And that then spiraled, right? So it ended up being everything that you were seeing, and anything that was perceived as being negative or, outside of that line of thinking was pushed down. Now, again, that's not necessarily a wrong thing that these, content creators did. I think a lot of people take grievance with Gary Vee in particular because he sort of came in, said, buy all this stuff, and then left pretty quickly. I think you can take grievance with that kind of mindset, especially with some of the things he was saying. Whether he was pumping and dumping, I'm not going to say that for sure either way, because you don't really know what was going through his head. But the perception, was there. When it comes to the likes of Jeff Wilson, it's again an interesting one, because in my opinion, the issue with this comes from whether or not he did it intentionally to try and deceive you as a viewer. Now, Jeff had some pretty interesting comments on the Sports Card Therapist interview that he did that was also with the great curator. And I'll put it on screen now. But essentially, one of the things that Jeff said was about that pass, he sort of realized, okay, the top 5 picks he stopped doing in terms of the cards you should be buying. He focused in on more what was rising and falling. But at the same time, he put out that kind of content because that's what the people wanted to see. That is Jeff being genuine. I guess that's fair, right? Because you're a content creator, you want to try and get views. The issue for mine comes that if you're somebody that understood that giving some of that messaging was poor and you could have done a better job when it came to explaining things that maybe vintage is probably better hold for long term, or why are we paying so much for a Luka Doncic card when we're not, paying the same kind of thing for Hall of Famers, right? This kinds of sensibility spending wasn't really being discussed on some of these channels. So was that intentional? And if it was intentional, that's what you should be going after these people for. And that's the kind of question that I want to dig a bit deeper on if I have the chance to try and talk to Jeff Wilson myself and ideally the likes of Gary Vee, but that'll never happen with someone like Gary Vee. I've had discourse with Jeff's team in the past around content before I go ahead and make a video. I want to clarify a few things. So if I could have the chance to talk to him, I would, because that's the kind of thing I want explained a bit further. In all honesty, when I look at Jeff's content, I think he is a new collector. He's talked about coming back in 2019. So I think a lot of his messaging came out of ignorance rather than, trying to deceive people. And you can sort of make that assessment given the amount of money he spent on cards, right? And the apparent losses he's made. I think it's a fair assessment to suggest that maybe he's not as good as investing as what he sort of makes it out to be for a channel called the Sports Card Investor. But again, we don't really know what his true intentions were or anything like that. I think people have the right to sort of go after him for aligning to certain businesses and certain sponsorships. I think many people needed to do a lot better when it came to taking on things. But I think that's the distinction we need to make when we're sitting back and talking about the level of influence that some of these content creators have had. You can't sit back and say, well, the accountability has to fall on the person watching completely and solely. Yes, that's fair, but you need to keep in mind how sort of inexperienced other people were when they sort of came in and were looking to start collecting cards, or they were seeing all the buzz, and it was, all these very large channels, like I said a bit earlier, pumping everything up, talking about this kind of thing being the future, sports card investing is the future, all this kind of thing, right? You need to chase the hot rookies, you need to speculate, you need to focus on Prism and all this kind of thing, completely disregarding and discounting some of these vintage cards and even, earlier shorter print run cards from Hall of Famers and things like that. That's the thing that we need to clarify here, and we can't sort of purely focus in on the accountability being on the viewer and then discounting all that stuff or ignoring all that sort of stuff. Now, one thing that I thought was pretty interesting in that Jeremy Lee live as well was Dennis DPZ talked to a few things around how negative content tells more to him about you as an individual than anything else, i.e. if you're consuming negative content, you're probably a negative person and are not happy in life. Now, there's a few things on that need to be broken down a bit further. I'd like to understand from him what he means by negative content. My channel gets called negative all the time. We've talked about this before. From my perspective, it's not negative content. Yes, we're talking about, negative things within the hobby, but it's done from a different perspective, right? It's done to highlight this sort of stuff so you as a viewer can get educated to try and avoid things moving forward. And when we've got people, and I'm not saying Dennis is this person that's doing this all the time, because he's been pretty open. He's talked to me in the past. He's mentioned that he's watched my videos and agreed with some of the things I've said. This is just a general statement to more of the hobby elite kind of people, where they say negative content's bad, stop watching it, these guys are tinfoil theories, yet they're not doing the same thing to the positive posse, right? If you want to hate on guys for being solely negative, which is pretty apparent because you're not looking at things in detail, right? You're only looking at things on surface level. That's why they think it's negative. Why aren't you then pointing the finger at the same people that were part of the positive group? You can't say that these guys are overly negative and all that kind of thing, and then discount some of the things that the likes of Sports Card Investor and, some of these other big channels, Gary Vee at the time, Card Collector 2, some of these vloggers. I'm sure there's many channels that I'm not thinking of right now. You can't sort of say that for one thing when not applied elsewhere, right? I think it all needs a balanced conversation and, some kind of critical thinking and not accusations, but digging deeper onto what the underlying meanings are of those things. Now, I probably sound like I'm going on a bit of a tangent right now, but I just wanted to talk to that because I think there's two sides to every story, and you can't purely look at it through a collector's lens or somebody that is switched on and is good at applying problem solving and critical thinking and questioning things and saying, well, Sports Card Investor, I didn't fall for that sort of stuff because it sounded a bit weird to me, or I knew what I wanted to buy in the first place. Other people are not thinking like that. And I think it's pretty evident that people that had this new money, like I said, that came in a bit confused, not knowing what to do, they were landing on those pages and sort of following the lead and going off what these people were saying. And again, it might not have been intentional from these pages or from these content creators. And I think time has told that some probably did it intentionally and others didn't. But that's sort of where things ended up. And you can't sort of let them wipe their hands completely clean of that. They needed to do a little bit better when they were presenting this message. And like I said a bit earlier, when I referenced Jeff's interview with a therapist, he sort of said, yeah, I'd probably go back and do things a little bit differently, especially when it comes to Hall of Famers and vintage. Now, again, is that just him saying it to try and save face, or is that him genuinely thinking like that because he was a bit ignorant in the past? That's the kind of thing I want to dig a little bit deeper on. Now, we've seen today a pretty interesting video, speaking of Jeff Wilson, from the likes of Sports Card Radio. That's something that I think is, pretty interesting and something that he should look to respond on, in my opinion. I'm going to be on Sports Card Radio's live 6 or 7 hours after you're seeing this video. It's 24 hours after recording it. So I'm keen to sort of chat through that amongst a few other topics as well. We've got a pretty interesting show planned. I'm a pretty balanced person, as you guys do know, but I think there's some questions there that Jeff should look to answer. And whilst it might be a bit of a nuisance for him to have to respond to that, because from his mind, he might be thinking, and it might be true, that he's done nothing wrong. So why does he have to respond to it? Like I said yesterday, when it came to fanatics commenting on these apparent backdoor cards, you being overly transparent, you coming out and just being truthful, take the emotion out of the situation, explain, okay, this is what happened, this is what I did, this is what didn't happen. I think that's going to win you more favors than not. So I'm keen to get your guys' thoughts on this, because that could be a pretty big problem for him and his business if those accusations did end up being true, right? And we'll have to sort of play it by ear. So check me out on Sports Card Radio's live tomorrow. Hopefully we can get some good questions and dialogue going. I know this ended up being about 11, 12 minutes long, but I just thought that was an interesting thing to talk to, because I really wish I could have been in on those comments, because I was there for a little bit with Sports Card Lives. I missed Mike Gio's one earlier today, but it was just an interesting thing to talk to on, how this is perceived when it comes to the accountability element. I think content creators need to do a lot better in general, right? They need to be more careful when they're taking on sponsorships. I think the industry as a whole, from the content creation space, did a terrible job at this over the last 2 years. And we've talked about it many times. You've had a lot of people that were so ignorant and they didn't know any better, i.e. the likes of Mojo Sports and some of the mistakes he's made, i.e. the mistakes that Card Collector 2 has made. But then you probably had people that took on sponsorships when maybe they shouldn't have in the first place. And there's some big accounts in there that I think did a pretty poor job. And Sports Card Investor might be one of those. And that's just because he's aligned himself with certain sponsors that have since collapsed or that he's recommended for you to use. Now, again, it is what it is. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'm a very balanced guy. You guys do know that. So I'm not sort of hating for the sake of hating. I think there's more of a discussion to have here. So I'm really keen to sort of do that. I just thought the comments from Jeremy and Mike were not necessarily one-sided, but they were just looking at it through their lens, right? And I think we need to look at it through the lens of the person who might have been new to cards, right? That came in with the stimulus money and all those kinds of things. I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong. I just think we need to have a deeper discussion of this and make sure that we're focusing in on both sides, because there are two sides to this. And I think it's naive to say that these guys didn't have an influence on the market in general. And when you're looking at the impact they've had, it's not to experienced collectors, it's to all these new people came in that were spending ridiculous money on base cards. They were getting base cards graded, they were buying out, stores and turning blasters into very expensive products. It's that kind of ignorant buying that was sort of fed by that hyper positivity from some of these large accounts. And I don't think that can be discounted or ignored like it seems to have been. And I don't think anyone's ignoring that intentionally. I just think people are looking at it through the wrong lens. So happy to have a chat with Mike. I want to jump on his channel in 2 weeks' time to maybe talk about this a little bit further. He's a pretty open guy from the topics I've heard him talk about in the past, so we won't be pointing fingers at each other, but I think it's just good to have a deeper chat around that and all that sort of stuff. So as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.